Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and today I want to start talking a little bit, and I may do this as kind of a continuous series where I talk about the realignments of American politics. And I'm going to go ahead and start with talking about how I honestly think we're in the middle of a realignment, and why I don't subscribe to the theory of realignment elections so much as a lot of other people think. Because I don't think you can have a realignment with just one election. You know, the changing of a political system takes time. I think we should all recognize that. By the way, I know how I said a few weeks ago that maybe I would consider on the weekends every now and then uploading, say, gaming stuff. I may or may not do that before I get into the topic of today. If there's a video tomorrow, it's probably going to be a game, but if not, then there's not going to be a video. Anyway, so let's start talking about realignment. So a lot of people are saying that 2016 has an argument to be made for a realignment election. For example, these were the recognized swing states in 2016. I think there was even an argument to be made for Texas, but I'm going to say that there's no real argument. You're going to say, that's a lot. And I'm going to say, yeah, that actually... Oh, I forgot about New Hampshire. Oops, sorry. I'm going to say, yeah, that's a large amount. You know? The plurality of electoral votes were swing votes. Now you could start paring this down to saying, well, yeah, New Mexico really wasn't up for grabs. Yeah, Georgia really wasn't up for grabs, but there were people who honestly believed in polling evidence that showed all of these states were competitive. So I think it's reasonable to assume that. However, you go back to 2012, I didn't see many Republicans arguing they could compete in New Mexico. I didn't see many Republicans arguing that Minnesota was on the table. I didn't see many Democrats arguing that Georgia was extremely on the table. I didn't see anyone making the argument that Maine at any point was on the table. So really, this is kind of what the map looked like. And I suppose a lot of people didn't really think Arizona was on the table. Some people would, but I think if you're kind of just saying, well, let's slow our roll there. So this is what I think a lot of people would have assumed the map would have been, right? 2008, there were a few surprises, but we were also in the middle of a recession, so I'm going to kind of go back a little bit. 2004, we look at that. Yeah, those were somewhat swingy. There were arguments to be made for Minnesota, Washington, and Oregon actually were somewhat competitive. No one thought North Carolina was ever going to be competitive. Maine wasn't really competitive at all. So this is kind of what Bush was looking at as a map. The second vote actually wasn't a swing vote at all. No one was even suspecting that it could turn the other way in 2004. You go back to 2000, and yeah, there is an argument to be made that the election was more competitive than expected. I'm gonna ignore the splits. Now, a lot of people would have argued that there were more swing states than not, but you know, we also had a weird 2000 was a weird election for a lot of reasons, but I don't really consider it a realignment election. You know, for the better part of it, since the 90s, I'm going to argue the time between 1988 and 2000, yeah, between 1988 and 2000 was a realignment for America. 2000 being the final stage in that change. And I think we're just starting to undergo a new realignment. You know, back then, the West was the primary swing region, and there were a few states that were actually surprisingly there were a few areas that were surprisingly blue, and some areas that were surprisingly swingy, and a few areas that were even surprisingly red. For example, Vermont. You know, pretty much the West was all Republican. Let me try and make that. Yeah. And the Northeast, it gets really weird, but 88 was the last time we were starting to enter a realignment. You know, it wouldn't have been too surprising to see California was considered a red state. Obviously, we know different, Now, this is the 2000 map we're looking at. Sorry, not the 2000 map. That's the 2000 map. This is 2004. But 2016, there's a reason why I think this is the start of a realignment. And the reason is we're starting to see areas that have gone Republican for a while starting to shift towards, somewhat towards the Democrats. Even more so. Okay, these are areas that used to be Republican that are shifting towards the Democrats. You could even make the argument for South Carolina as well. But there are also areas that are shifting towards the Republicans that used to be Democratic areas, heavily Democratic areas, in fact. Or at the very least, were swing states that are shifting very much towards the Republican Party, and I can even make the argument that New Hampshire is starting to move in that direction. But I won't, because New Hampshire is a swing state, and it's always been considered a swing state. I think I forgot to include Virginia in that Republican state starting to move towards the Democrats. Now, is this enough for the Republicans long term to even out the losses in, say, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia? No, maybe not. So let's just assume that those areas go to the new party, right? Now let's take out the swing states that still remain. Florida, New Hampshire, this vote in Nebraska. Not really. So that means the Republicans are going to need to find new swing states. And their thought is that they are going to try and maybe go, their thought should be that they need to try and go to the Pacific Northwest. I'm a little skeptical. Or they may say, well, we need to try and regain some ground in New England. Again, I'm skeptical of that strategy. Instead, they may try and focus on trying to win back the Southwest. Again, that's not enough on its own, so they're going to need to adopt at least a few strategies. Obviously, Florida is going to be a key part. Keeping Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina swingy is going to also be a massive part, but they also need to keep Arizona swingy, they need to keep Colorado swingy, they need to keep Nevada swingy. May need to invest some resources in Virginia, they definitely need to keep Texas, and they need to start investing in other places, like Washington, Oregon, California even. I'll take California off, as well as maybe trying to get back Vermont from when they held it in the 60s, up until about the 80s, 90s. Maybe go after the rest of New England while they're at it. Maybe talk about the Mid-Atlantic. Maybe add in Maryland there. But Democrats are obviously going to go after Texas. They're going to go after the South. They need to try and keep at least those 4 states. So in the next few years, I could see all of these states, they're also going to need to try and make some inroads in the South. I can see every state I've seen highlighted in yellow being at least somewhat competitive at some point in one of the cycles. Obviously, there are certain patterns that are deeply ingrained. And I don't honestly think a lot of these states will be hyper competitive. I'll leave Rhode Island yellow. And I'll also leave that yellow. So this wouldn't be too far off of a map that I expect to see in 2020. With the states that I've got highlighted as red going towards a Republican, with states highlighted blue is states where the Democrat is going to be mostly favored. This is going to be the second stage of the realignment. It doesn't matter who wins. What matters is the margins compared to previous cycles. Say if the Democrat wins, but only by narrow amounts in these states, or even loses most of them, let's say the Democrat manages to win despite losing those 3 states. Say they pick up Nevada, Colorado, Virginia, they keep Delaware and Rhode Island, and of course those states are more competitive. Say the Republican keeps that vote and keeps that vote, but the Democrats pick up, say, North Carolina and Arizona, but lose Florida. Well, that's a win for the Democrats, right? It's a narrow win, but it indicates that even though they're improving in the Southwest and starting to make inroads in the South, they're losing ground up here. And I'd probably expect Texas to be closer than 16 if this were the outcome. Or let's flip only one state. Let's say Arizona holds on. Cool. The Democrats are going to say, well, yeah, we're losing ground up here, but we're making up ground here that we'll be able to keep in the next cycle. 2024 would probably be the end of the realignment cycle, with maybe the map looking like this, which would be a massive win for the Democrats. They claim it as a landslide, and it does look like that. They claimed Texas for the first time since the 70s. And they would also realize that these aren't sure bets anymore, and probably 4 years later, we can maybe talk about that and, say New Hampshire going. It'd still be a victory. But then 4 years later, because some of these would still be considered at least swingy, flip Texas and Arizona. Still doesn't flip it, but we don't know what the population would be. But a realignment takes time. It's not just a simple one election and everything changes. I think that's what people often get wrong about realignment elections and political realignments here in the United States, is that, oh, 1968, that was a realignment election. No, it wasn't. We had those states going to Wallace. I believe Virginia went to Nixon. If I remember correctly. I think New Mexico also went to Humphrey. Trying to remember. I think Iowa went. West Virginia. I'm trying to remember the exact breakdown. I think Texas went for Humphrey as well. But because of the way the vote broke down, actually, let's look at 271. Because they at least have the historic maps. 68. Ah, there we go. So you look at this map and you're going to say, well, that's a little bit weird, that's a little bit weird. But the main thing to note is that those 5 states in the South voted for Wallace. Nixon crossed 300 electoral votes. That's not that big a deal. But what you're going to notice is a lot of people would say, well, this was a realignment election because it changed the identity of the South, whereas if you go to 64, some people will also say this helped in the realignment, as you notice that Goldwater made certain appeals. That's not entirely accurate, and I'll go into the reasons why. And of course, this is Nixon versus Kennedy, and you can already see the South isn't exactly as solid as people want to make it out to seem. Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, were voting for the Republican, despite, say, all of these states voting for a Democrat. You go back to 56, which was Eisenhower. Eisenhower wins Louisiana, and he's picking up other southern states, or at least culturally southern states. Florida at the time was much more southern than it is today. And you go to 72, where Nixon wins anything, you really can't tell how heavily it went for him, because the only other person was McGovern, and, well, he won D.C. in his home state, and that was it. Then you can start seeing some of the swing towards the Democrats a year later going to find on the West Coast. So even though there was a realignment where the South did change its political identity towards Republican, it's not as simple as one election. It's not as simple as one issue. And you can even see that as the alignment shift is finishing, states are starting to alter their identity, right? You go to 76, and if it was slightly more in favor of, and you can see Jimmy Carter won the entire South, so it's not as solid as you would think, and the election was actually much more competitive than I think a lot of people remember. Ford really only needed to flip Texas and one other state, Texas and Missouri, right? Texas and Missouri flipped. That puts Ford winning the election. Or let's go Ohio and Missouri. But then you look at 80, and Carter. And this also indicates that the South wasn't as Republican as people thought it was. It still voted for Democrats. Carter did extremely well in the South, despite getting throttled almost 500 to, 489, 49. Carter got thrashed in this election, yet he wasn't that far behind. It just shows how close the American election was. And look at the popular vote. That's an 8 million vote gap. There was about a 10% gap between the two, and yet the election could have been much closer than it really was. And then you go to 84, and this is where you start seeing the South actually turning into a Republican area. 88 is the start of what I would consider another realignment. As you notice, yeah, the South is starting to, actually be as Republican as its reputation in that era. California starts to swing. These states actually do flip. New York starts to go. West Virginia starts to go. And these are actually very Democratic states nowadays. And there was a 6 million vote gap with slightly less than 100 million votes total. And you can also see New England starting to flip. What other changes? The Rust Belt, the Upper Midwest starting to flip. But these three states were always kind of swingy anyway, so grain of salt there. You can start seeing shifts out west as well. Again, I've already said California. 92 is when that flip really does the change in political identity really does change. Bill Clinton's a Southerner, so there's some slight regional weirdness going on. And you can see that happen again in 96. A little bit of regional weirdness going on. But you also see that Montana, these states aren't as Republican as their reputation. And then 2000, these aren't deep, deep red. These are barely flipping. And you finally see that, yeah, the Republicans aren't ever going to compete in this area for at least 20, 30 years, maybe longer. The Upper Midwest finally flipped. These areas finally flipped 100% the other direction. And then you see in 2000, this is 2004, the trends are pretty much baked in. Bush doesn't do poorly in a state like California, but it's not great. You do see some signs of weakness in this area, but these are still flipping toward. Tennessee is still flipping towards the Republicans. Same with these states. 2008, we see again the trend of these states not being as Republican as thought. And then, of course, you got Indiana, Ohio, North Carolina flipping, Virginia flipping by a healthy amount. And then 2012, this is actually where I would consider the start of the realignment, where Democrats aren't losing too much ground in the South, despite Obama not being as popular as he was in 2008, as well as having a much tougher opponent and much less going in his favor. But you also see the Southwest starting to move in his direction. You start seeing the true solidification of states like Washington and Oregon, of the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. And then 16, as we all know, Donald Trump won, and he completely rewrote the book. At least that's what we would consider it to be. But again, you see this trend continued. You actually see some competitiveness along this area. You see New England starting to fall apart in terms of its fervent support of Democrats. Virginia stays Democratic despite a Republican victory. And you see these areas still not as Republican as we expected. And this shows that, yes, Democrats are improving in the Sun Belt, but Republicans are also making gains up in the Northeast, as well as the Rust Belt and Upper Midwest. and their support in the Mountain West is still solid, except for Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, soon Arizona. Alaska was also more competitive, but that's just, I think, a byproduct, right? So, yeah, it's not as clear cut as, oh, one election changes everything. The truth is, one election doesn't change a damn thing. And the reality is, that a realignment takes a lot of time, and trends start building as soon as that realignment finishes, and you can start really seeing the results towards the end of an era. So we're seeing the results of some trends that started in 2000 after that realignment from the the conservative era, which was primarily the post-FDR years, where you had Eisenhower and then quickly Nixon and Lyndon Baines Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson and Kennedy, but the nation wasn't really in favor of the Democrats. They just happened to have one popular candidate, and then they only had 2 terms with 2 presidents, so Then you had Nixon, who royally messed things up and gave the presidency to Carter, essentially. Again, another just brief punctuation. Reagan came in and extended the Republican era by another 2 terms. And then you had H.W., who, if it wasn't for the popularity of Reagan, would not have won in 88. 88 was the start of that realignment. And it kind of finished by 2000. And during the modern political era that started in 2000, what you see is that states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Ohio, Iowa have started to move towards the Republicans in a lot of ways. But you have the coasts in New England moving pretty much towards the Democrat, and maybe to a degree you can start seeing them coming back towards the Republicans. Maybe not the West Coast, I would never make that argument, but you can start seeing some of the East Coast perhaps moving back towards the Republicans. But that could just be their partisanship is not as heavy as, say, a state like California. So in the future, I may talk about why the South went Republican and talk about how it never really became as Republican as people want to believe. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy. Bye.